Hey guys, welcome to my Learning in Public series where I aim to share lessons that I've gathered along the way as I build AI agent projects. And so just some context before we go into the learning details. So I've read the 12 Weeks Year book, and I've decided to make my own challenge where I essentially try to go from 0 to 1 in 12 weeks. And what I mean by 1 here is essentially going from not knowing nothing at all to being able to build AI workflow automations solutions. And just to provide some context as well, I don't have a software engineering background, although I did a CS degree back in university, but that was 4 years ago. So I would say this is almost starting from the ground up, basically. And so the program that I'm about to show you is essentially made by Cloud. I essentially just prompted it to give me I just say, hey, pretend like you're a senior engineer and you're a good tutor and stuff. And I just got it to generate like a learning roadmap for me. And I think it's pretty interesting because what you see is that each project essentially builds on top of the previous project in terms of the learnings, right? So as you can see here, the curriculum structure looks like this. There's 10 projects, and each one builds on top of the previous one. For example, the first one is basically focused on learning the basic LLM interactions, and then the next one introduce some retrieval techniques, so that's going into RAG. And then the third is basically adding some temporal dimensions to it, so being able to read data based on, like, for example, in a chronological order. And then the fourth is adding a multi-person dimension. And this is essentially saying, okay, so now we want to read conversations from different people. Like, let's say in a chat, I'm talking to someone. I want to be able to read the messages from both of us and then analyze them in a chronological way. So that's chat analysis system. And then we go into this calisthenics video analyzer. And this is actually a project that I've specifically told the Cloud that I would like to include because I do some calisthenics myself, and I just want to be able to sort of make some projects that are also practical use cases in my daily life. So I thought this might be cool, just basically analyzing all the video that I've taken in my calisthenics trainings and using that to then get the AI to advise me on what I can improve on, whether there's some areas that my posture is not good, for example. And then next one will be Telegram Bookmark Manager, and this is where I start to integrate my AI solutions to different platforms, for example, Telegram. And then the next one is Voice Enabled Assistant. So this introduces multi-modal, so using voice in this case. And then we move on to multi-agent workflow systems, where I would essentially introduce a multi-agent ecosystem. And then after that would just be process automation. So I plan to follow this curriculum structure. I wonder how far I can go because it does look quite challenging and quite intimidating, to be honest. But I don't want to let that stop me. And I think I will learn a lot just by doing these projects. So that's cool. And the ultimate goal, as you can see on the right side here, is that I essentially, for each project, want to maximize my learnings as much as I can. So essentially squeezing as much learnings out of each of these projects. And I don't really want to, limit each project to a certain number of weeks, for example, because for example, now I don't know what I don't know, and so I don't actually know how much effort does each of these projects require. For all I know, these are like really hard projects and it might be really hard to implement it, and so it might take up to a month, for example. So I don't want to set like unrealistic expectations here because I don't want to rush through these projects as well. So yeah, let's just see how long it takes to go through all of these. I doubt that I can finish all of these within 12 weeks, but yeah, let's see how it goes. And so over the past week, I have worked on Personal AI Assistant, where it's essentially just a basic LLM interaction. And yeah, as you can imagine, it is quite a very basic project. But I think just just reflecting back, I think there are a few key learnings that I've definitely gained from this project already. And the first is that before starting this project, I was faced with this dilemma in picking whether I should use the OpenAI library, or just use frameworks like LangChain, LlamaIndex, AutoGen, etc. And there are thousands of these frameworks, right? And so there are two challenges here. One is that should I use OpenAI or should I use, frameworks? Should I use basic primitive library from the provider itself, or should I use a framework? And then within the framework, which framework should I use? AutoGen, there is Ecno, there is LangChain, there's LlamaIndex, there's 1,000 frameworks. So it's just very paralyzing, and it honestly took me a while just to actually get started in this project, because I was just basically over preparing, right? And that essentially stalled my progress. So when I got Cloud to draft this curriculum structure for me, it just so happens that it also actually recommended me to use OpenAI based on the requirements that I told what I want to achieve out of it. And so yeah, I think that was I think even before Cloud's recommendation to use OpenAI, I already had an inclination to use OpenAI, because I actually tried using LlamaIndex before, and what I realized was that it essentially wraps a lot of the implementation behind the hood, and so there are a lot of steps in between that I can't see, and as a beginner it just gets a bit confusing. And so yeah, like I've mentioned here, there's pros and cons to both. In terms of OpenAI, is that there's a lot of upfront configurations that is required, like for example, setting chunking overlaps or chunking strategies, how exactly do you want to segment things, etc. And so going through each of these process requires a lot of thinking, but at the same time, I think that's exactly what I need for my learning at this stage, because I'm trying to go as deep as I can and understand everything and see how all the pieces fit together. Whereas for the frameworks like LangChain and LlamaIndex, they essentially wrap around OpenAI API, and it simplifies a lot of process, because it could take, for example, two different methods that are, like for example, in a whole process, it could take like two parts and wrap them into a single method. And so sometimes it just gets a bit confusing for me as a beginner, and it's more of a black box approach. And so I think a lesson here for me is that reading online advice is good, but ultimately I think we should limit ourselves to reading them, like maybe just spend an hour reading them, and then after that just be aware of all the pros and cons, but ultimately we will still need to try them both to understand what works for us. Because I think the answer is different for everyone. Like some people prefer just to use the simplest thing that they can, so that they can get started as quickly as they can and then learn along the way. Whereas there are some people who prefers to understand everything under the hood, and then once they understand, they can then start going on to using frameworks that can just essentially streamline their workflow. And yeah, for me, I prefer using OpenAI, because for the reasons that I mentioned, that I want to understand everything before I eventually streamline my workflow, potentially using some frameworks. So that's my first learning in this project. So then I think the second learning is that I found tools and memory especially challenging. And this is really as hard as this first project went, because essentially what I've done in this first project is creating a client, and that which is this here client, and then feeding in the input and the tools, and as well as the model. And I've already found input and tools a bit challenging. So let me explain, right? So for the memory, I was actually contemplating between using OpenAI's API, which is the previous response ID API, which is essentially a way for us to manage the conversation state. And then the second method is a more manual way of controlling the window, right, which is a sliding window. Well, I'm not sure if that's a actual name that people use, but yeah, that was what I thought might make sense. So I just used that. So the first method is essentially OpenAI's previous response ID method, and essentially what I would do is just feed in this. So I would first of all prompt OpenAI to provide me a response, and then I would then use this response. It has an ID attached to it. I would just feed it into the next response generation. So then in that way, it remembers the question and answer that it has provided me in the previous response, and then use that to inform the most current response generation. And this method is right out of the box, right? It's provided by OpenAI, and it's very easy. But I think one thing I realized is that it's not sustainable, especially in production settings, because like as input token grows, then this might become problematic, because you can imagine that as the conversation becomes very long, then first of all, most of the time the system message is right at the top, which is the first message that you tell your client how exactly you should behave like. And so in long conversations, that part would definitely be out of the context, because it just gets stacked on with a more recent conversation history. And then the second thing is that it would also forget some earlier conversations as well. And so what I've decided to do is to implement the manual sliding window, where essentially it takes in the last 10 messages. Oh, sorry. And also for the first method, I think I also wanted to avoid the overflowing problem, because if there's too many tokens in the input, then the output might get truncated, right? So I just thought about that, and maybe using a manual sliding window can actually help to negate that problem. So essentially, manual sliding window, I'll just give it a definite amount of history that it can take in. For example, here I've set it to 10. Window size is 10. And so in this way, it's a bit more manual, because then at every time when I feed it a question, I must feed it into the conversation history, and I must also manually feed in the tool calls, messages, and also the responses from the AI into this conversation history array as well. And then the second challenge was on tools. So I think at the start I was a bit confused between like the function call and the actual function, the function definition and the actual function call itself. Because at the start, to me it was a bit confusing, because I was just looking at this code right here, right, which is right out from the OpenAI docs. It says, there's a method here, and then there's also like description. And so I was just wondering, like, does that mean that if we just give these tools, because this is all I see at the start, right? Like we are literally creating this function here and then feeding it into the client. Does that mean that you would just be able to read the description and invoke, somehow magically call the method itself just from the description? And then the second question is, then we have this code snippet here as well, which basically calls the function getWeather, but then it was a bit indirect to me. Like it didn't make sense to me how both of these would sort of work together to then eventually be fed into tools, because it wasn't obvious to me that getWeather and then calling just the string here would connect both of these together. So yeah, that was a bit confusing to me at the start. And I think what really helped to make sense of this was that I just thought of it this way, right? So step one is to declare, you would basically write out a function like how you would usually in any code, where getWeather, you would call the API, get some data back, and then return whatever data that you need. And then after that, you would then feed this exact function into this function definition. So which is like a think of it as a toolkit, like a like when you look at mechanics, they have like a box of tools, and so this is really just that box, and you essentially just throw that getWeather function, the tool, into your toolbox, right? So now you have the toolbox, and then you hand this toolbox over to the AI agent. Meaning, let's say in this case, in our toolbox, we have get weather function, which is one tool, and then we also have web search preview, which is another tool. So there are two tools in this toolbox. And so now this AI agent having this toolbox also has two tools, which it can then choose which one to call based on the question that you have provided to the AI agent. For example, if you're asking, hey, what is today's weather in Kuala Lumpur, for example, then it would choose, okay, based on get weather's description and web search preview description, which is the more relevant one that I should use that will get me the answer. And so you'll then pick, for example, in this case, you'll pick get weather, and then it would call this function here, right? Whereas if you're looking for, just another question, if you're asking a question that you will need to search the internet for, then you just call the web search preview function. So I think this was helpful for me to really understand how all these fits together. And then the last lesson that I've learned is about prompt engineering. So my sort of thinking at the start was that prompt engineering is very important, especially to improve the model's accuracy, because like I've always seen a lot of articles saying that the cheapest and fastest way for you to improve a model's accuracy is by doing prompt engineering, just trying different prompts. And then the second thing you do is then try to do evals and fine-tuning your model by feeding in data, right? And then just testing the answer that you get out of the model against the data that you feed it. And then the last one is just to build it from the ground up, like whatever AI model that you want, right? And so I was just relying a lot on prompt engineering, and I was quite curious about it and wanted to learn more about it. But then later on, there are a few things that really changed my mind. And the first is I was watching this podcast of Lanny's podcast and the OpenAI's Chief Product Officer. And one of the things that the Chief Product Officer mentioned was that, he said that if OpenAI was doing their job well, then essentially prompt engineering would not be needed, right? And so I can already imagine that probably in the next 5 years or even lesser than that, right? We'll probably not be too focused on prompt engineering anymore. And so I was wondering if this is really a skill that I really want to invest my time in learning. And then later on, I also found a Reddit post which talked about how we can just get AI to craft, prompts that we can use to prompt Cloud, for example, to write a good prompt for us to feed into our AI models. I know that might be a bit confusing. Let me say that again, right? So essentially, I have this prompt which I can feed into Cloud and tell it to generate me a well-structured prompt based on whatever that I want. I hope that that's clear. But yeah, so with these 2 points, I just think like, okay, why not in the short term, I just get AI to write me a good prompt. And of course, I'll need to go through some of the materials to understand what a good prompt looks like. But I think that's as far as I would go, knowing what good looks like and then getting AI to then generate for me these prompts and then make sure that it's good. Then I can just use it for my models. So that's the direction that I think is the most worthwhile in terms of time. And then hopefully then the internal AI prompts will get better and we don't really need to focus too much on prompt engineering. And I think the OpenAI CPO, he also mentioned that he really leans heavily into evals and fine-tuning. And he mentioned that in the next 5 to 10 years, probably every company would have their own fine-tuned models for specific use cases. And this really made me consider to invest more time into learning evals and using data sets to fine-tune models. I'm not sure when I will start learning that, but I think that's definitely in my plans, my learning plans. Yeah. Alright, so that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching if you're still watching this. So just to summarize my 3 key learnings from my first week of learning in public. Number 1 is stop reading too many reviews. If you're curious in trying any frameworks, libraries, etc., just test it. Just build a very simple project, test it, and then see which one you prefer. Just build the exact same projects with all of the frameworks that you are curious about, and just see which one meets your need the most. Because I mean, like even though it takes the most, I mean, it sounds upfront, I mean, on the outset it sounds like it takes up a lot of time, but actually it saves you a lot more time than just reading through a lot of opinions online, and then you still can't decide on which one you want because you haven't really tried it out yourself. And then my second learning is memories and tools. I think now I have a clearer idea of how memory and tools work, so that's cool. But I what do you call it? Yeah, so I was actually trying to implement RAC, and I still face a bit of trouble understanding tokenizer, and I think that's part of tools in a way because that involves calling, like retrieving data, and so that's something that I'm still working on. And then the third learning is that about prompt engineering, I don't necessarily want to spend too much time learning prompt engineering, and so I would rather spend my time on evals and using data to fine-tune models. So yeah, these are my 3 key lessons for my first week, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave a comment, about if you're also early in your journey building AI agents, whether you find this relatable or not, and if yes, I would definitely love to speak to you guys and hear about what you guys think about this as well. And even for people who are way ahead along in their journey, definitely let me know what I'm doing wrong, what I'm doing right, and how I can improve. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.